My name's Halle Winkler. This is Duct-taping the gates of chaos shut. The weird little useful sustainable indie. Last night it was pointed out to me that there are a lot of speakers here who have the last name Lee, or a first name which ends with Lee, and that I'm part of this conspiracy. It actually goes deeper. My middle name is Lee, yeah? So I'm Halle Lee. That's what we call tail recursion. So, why am I giving this talk? I run a little product business here in Berlin called Politepix. Politepix makes an SDK for creating offline speech interfaces in iOS apps. So you can do speech recognition and speech synthesis with it. It's an unusual kind of business in our greater ecosystem because it is a framework business rather than an app business. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do it, but I think there's a lot of information in there that is probably also very applicable to doing an app product business. I hope so. This talk, more than a bunch of other talks that I've given, fills me with mortal terror. I was always wondering why that was, and then I realized, that it's really because in our platform, we have product indies that, if you include the desktop, have been running successful indies for like 20 years, 10 years, 5 years. And mine has been going for 3.5 years, right? So quite a bit less. But it's been a very interesting and also a very challenging 3.5 years on our platform. So I thought, all right, I'll give it a try. Maybe I have some stuff to share that will be useful. I started Politepix because I was at apps, not great. I got good feedback on them. My second app was a US App Store staff pick for a couple of months. In terms of design and programming, apparently they were fine, but I could not crack the code on marketing. And if you can't figure out app marketing, you can't actually do an app product business. It's very simple. So in the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, I decided to hit the pause button on my business and reconceptualize and decide what to do next. However, this is not one of those failure talks. We work in a famously failure-tolerant industry. And I think, this is really good that our industry is sort of famous for giving people second chances. And that's a big improvement on the way that it used to be. But I also think we obsess a little bit too much about the positive aspects of failure. I think the biggest problem with that is that failure is not really as rich in data as its reputation. And particularly when we're talking about the App Store, where very little information ever comes out of it under any circumstances. Yeah? And if you have an unsuccessful app, really you're going to be guessing about why it wasn't successful. I also think focusing on failure leads to a very interesting kind of conceptual error. Imagine for a second that you launch a new app product and you set a sales target for yourself for 2 months hence that you want to sell 10,000 units. 2 months pass, you sell 7,500 units. So, was it a failure? Is it a failed product? Did you actually just set the wrong amount of time for your target? Or did you allocate your resources incorrectly in the right amount of time? So the first one is a failure. The second two are basically undersized successes. They're underfed successes. And I became very interested in this question at this time that I was sort of hitting the stop button and starting fresh. So when we have these times where we say, okay, this isn't working, what do I do next? How do you proceed? Epictetus was an ancient philosopher of the Stoic school, and Mary Poppins and Lou Reed are two of our better modern philosophers. And they say, with intention is how you proceed. You ask yourself a question. The most unsettling first world question, right? Given our extraordinary luck in being able to ask this question, and then perhaps to do what answer we decide on What do we want to do? This is a very hard question to ask yourself. I don't think it's so complicated. I think everyone in this room is actually a creative person. You're a programmer, you're a designer, you're somebody who brings people together in order to work on creative problems. What we want is actually not so deeply existential and complicated. We want to make things which are of use to people. And that, by the way, can also be entertainment. That also has a use. When I was trying to figure out what I wanted, I made a list. I literally just wrote down a little list. So the first thing was getting back to this question about undersized successes. I did not want to start from scratch. I wanted to build on something which was already demonstrably working. So when I released my third app, All Ears, the app was not very well received. But in the course of making the app, I had also created a library called OpenEars to allow me to do the speech recognition functionality of All Ears. And when the app didn't do anything, I released the library. The library was better received than the app. So I thought, okay, I would like to do something with that. The next thing, and like I mentioned, this is sort of end 2011, beginning 2012, is that Siri had just come out. And I think Siri is marvelous. But I also thought that a lot of the functionality of Siri could probably also be done with offline recognition. Siri is very dependent on cloud services. And I am personally very concerned about data privacy questions, about users' ability to keep their own speech private in the area of speech recognition. So I thought, okay, well, if I think that you can do some of this stuff with offline recognition, that's where the recognition is only occurring on the user's device, prove it. Yeah? And so I thought I would like to make a strong case for offline speech recognition. And then I also thought it would be interesting to have some influence on the development of user experience in offline recognition by stealth, by working on an API. In order to decide how I would make this into a business, I spent a lot of time looking at other businesses, and not just businesses in our sector. What I noticed is that we are a little bit unusual on our platform in that we think that a business is often like one thing, like an app, where you put out an app and it's very successful on the App Store. In the rest of the business world, usually there is some diversity in a product line and some consonance, so the diversity protects you from shocks. If you make one app and then Apple Sherlocks it, that's a shock. If you have more than one app, then that experience doesn't send you back to the start. In consonance, your products are in harmony with each other. Each product builds interest in your other products. So I thought, okay, well, how do I want to do this with OpenEars? I knew that I wanted to keep OpenEars free, but I didn't really want to do the business model in which you sell support. The reason for that is that I was concerned that it creates a little bit of a perverse incentive to not make things as simple to use as humanly possible. The reason that I mention that is not because I think that other framework or library businesses which sell support are making things more difficult than necessary. I wanted to mention it because I think that if you ever notice a core value of yours, the safest place where you can put it is in your business model. If you put it in a manifesto and your business model does something different, then the more successful your business is, the more it will take you away from your core values. Your business model is the safest place to put your core values. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do something a little bit different. OpenEars is going to be free, but I'm going to create 3 extensions, and the extensions are going to do like sort of particularly gnarly other tasks relating to speech that you might need to do in a speech recognition app. And now I have actually 5 extensions to OpenEars. So that's 6 software products, pretty complex. They're extremely technically interdependent. And there is 1 developer, right? So this is a situation where you have to run actually a very tight ship, or chaos is going to come knocking on the door. before I get into the meat of the talk, which is about how to avoid that, I felt that I should tell you about 3 little things that I discovered totally by accident in the process of making this business that have saved me so much trouble that it would really be remiss not to mention them. The first one is meet the neighbors. This is actually from the Agile Manifesto, and it's meet your neighbors, actually. But I usually think of it as meet the neighbors because it sounds like a wacky sitcom, and that's pretty close to the actual situation sometimes. Meet the neighbors is when you start a new project, look around your sort of immediate ecosystem and think about who else is there, and build a relationship with them. It's not that complicated. For Politepix, my neighbor is Carnegie Mellon University's Sphinx project, which is like the major dependency of OpenEars. This is an interesting neighbor to have because, of course, on one hand, Politepix is a for-profit business, and Carnegie Mellon University is a not-for-profit research institution. On the other hand, Politepix is a really, really tiny business, and CMU has a like 1.6 billion endowment, and about 22% of their research funding comes from the United States Department of Defense. So they don't need sponsorship from Politepix, I've asked. But it leads to an interesting question, which is actually, what can I do for them? So I thought about this quite a bit. And obviously I give them like bugs and fixes if I know about such a thing. But I thought, actually what's more useful is taking away a lot of their support overhead for iOS development. And so Politepix does that for them. And I think that's valuable to them because it isn't actually a platform that they're particularly fascinated by. And the other thing, I think is a sort of obvious ethical issue, which is any time that I talk about OpenEars, I talk about CMU Sphinx. And this leads to cool stuff. Last summer, I found out that NASA actually had made an app using OpenEars. And the app is going to go to the International Space Station this year. And this is this is just such an excess of good news. And when you have this situation where there's so much good news, it's so pleasant and easy to make sure that it gets shared and to really talk a lot about CMU and talk about your neighbors. And everyone likes to get some good publicity, yeah? And then NASA gave me a bunch of bugs and fixes, and I gave them to CMU, so I can also help my neighbors talk to each other. I think the primary question with meet your neighbors is how can I be of use? The next thing is about role models. It's good to have a role model. We all have them. Companies or people who are doing amazing things that we look up to. It's good to have role models. It's really good to have idiot role models. When I was starting Politepix, I had a software vendor to me who was terrible. It was a company that I needed to work with because they had like one particular technical thing that was so important to me. But they were also one of these companies where all of their customers are constantly ranting to them on Twitter, and they are sort of endlessly writing blog posts of apology about, how we made this terrible decision and we're so sorry about how it affects you. And at first I was so angry at them all the time. And then one day I kind of noticed that there was something about the structure of their software products that kind of reminded me a little bit of my own, but like in 3 years after a bunch of bad choices. And then I was completely fascinated by them. I wanted to know everything about them. Who are these people? Where did they come from? How did they make those decisions? What did they used to do? And I became completely obsessed with them. And I've learned so much from not doing what they do. If you ever encounter this kind of company, cherish them. Yeah, it's like getting a visit from the ghost of bad decisions future. The last one is just very quickly, learn double entry bookkeeping. if you're running a business, about 50% of accountants and lawyers are below average, naturally, and 50% of them find it very difficult to take a very small business seriously when it's first starting, and that means that you're going to fire some accountants and lawyers at the beginning, because it isn't the same 50%. I had a terrible accountant right at the start. I fired him, and then I realized that I couldn't understand my books because I didn't understand double-entry bookkeeping. So I learned it, but then I discovered, one, it's not that hard to learn. Two, it's actually totally logical. So as a programmer, it's no problem. It will give you great insight into sort of, first of all, errors while they're in progress, and also projections for the future. But the best thing about it is that when you find out what side of the ledger capital is written down on, then when you hear about a ridiculous startup getting its Series A round, you'll have the appropriate emotional response, which is sympathy. Okay, so I live here in Berlin, and I sort of live about 10 blocks that way. And in the winter, when it gets really cold, we feed the birds. We have one of these nice Berlin terraces. And the birds like to fling their seeds. Die Spatzen, they fling. And eventually we have seeds on the floor of the terrace, and then sometimes you get a mouse, right? When you see one mouse, you may be about to have 7 mice. And if you should happen to see 7 mice, then game over. You are about to have infinite mice. And that's the reason that mice are the foot soldiers of entropy. And I've made you a little field guide to the foot soldiers of entropy. The first foot soldier of entropy is industriousness. Industriousness sounds like a positive characteristic, right? It is in our industry. We love to talk about how busy we are. But undifferentiated industriousness is actually very stupid. A small business can easily fill 100% of your time. And if you're busy on anything that isn't moving your business forward, and you know what, that's really just improving your product and your marketing, that's it. Then all you're doing is you're tiring yourself out, and you're also decreasing your reserves in case of a surprise, and there are always surprises. So we have to get deeply in touch with our programmer's virtue of abject laziness and automate everything. This is like a phrase that we use in software architecture, but actually it applies to everything in running a business, an app product business. When I was trying to figure out where all my time was going, I noticed that documentation was a production task that I spent a great deal of time on, and that I was dissatisfied with the amount of people using my documentation. So the first tool that I wrote was a tool basically to extract definitions from my interface, which is then the only place that I ever wrote any information about how to use the API, and it would create it would publish to the website, it would create a set of HTML docs, it would create a doc set and a PDF and an EPUB. And by creating all of this stuff, I greatly increased the amount of usage of my documentation because people like to use documentation in different formats. So this was something that took up a lot of manual production time, but I haven't actually touched this since 2012. I haven't spent a minute doing any manual creation of documentation since 2012. The next thing that came up is snippet-driven development. Do you know this? Like when people go to Stack Overflow and ask for the codes. So probably, I doubt that there are any snippet-driven developers in this room, but it is a really big part of life if you create a tool for developers. And at first I was a snob about it. If they want snippets, they have to go to Stack Overflow. Mistake! If somebody gets the codes from Stack Overflow, they're very likely to be wrong, and then also you're going to be supporting not one person with the wrong codes, but the many thousands of people who find Stack Overflow first. So I thought, okay, I have to get serious about this. my second tool was called the Tutomatic, and this is another one-button publishing tool that takes all of the information just from one place, and it creates customizable and copy-pastable tutorials for OpenEars and any plugins in it. So you actually just flip switches and say exactly what kind of app you're making, and then it gives you copy and pastable code. So this satisfies the give me the codes people, but also I can insert a little bit of developer education in here. And also I know that the codes are right. So this was the second one. I've also not actually had to look at this since 2012. I just have to update the original sources. And how did I know when it was time to create a tool, when it would be beneficial? I have a really rough heuristic for it, but it's been correct 100% of the time. If you do a manual production task 3 times, it's an ongoing task in your life. If you see that this happens and you're planning to run your business for a long time, you can make a tool for it. The next big sort of time drain for me was giving support to people in my forums where they had not actually found a previous discussion which answered their questions. So I got an existing plugin and modified it a bit so that it would tell people about a previous discussion when they were asking a question. And then I wrote some macros to deal with the kind of last stragglers. And this really, this got rid of a huge amount of my support overhead. There was just one more kind of support issue. This is a very, very scientific chart. You can tell because it's in 3 dimensions. These are the kinds of people who come and ask me questions on my forums. So over here on your right, fascinating questioners. These are people, you'll have them with your apps as well. People where you're like, really, does that work? Is that possible with my app or with my framework? People doing really weird things that are really interesting and they have complicated questions, but you're really happy to talk to them. In the middle, normal questions. Yeah, these are the ones that just really go away if you give people a lot of self-help tools that work for them. The last one is hapless questioners. Hapless questioners, very small amount of people. They are, let's say, because of perhaps a language difficulty, because perhaps they are not actually a programmer, but they've inherited the responsibilities of a programmer. Those people we can feel quite sorry for. Or perhaps because of a very special outlook on the rest of humanity. These are people that it is challenging to impossible to support them. Now, when I created all of these self-help tools for the people in the middle, this is what happened. This looks good, right? But you'll notice that the hapless one is now the same amount of questions as everyone else. And I noticed that I started to get very freaked out in the morning about looking at my forums and seeing what kind of questions were going to be there. So my last tool that I made for this is actually, if you're into linguistics, you can do stuff like this. It's a sentiment analysis tool that I created as a service of OS X. And what it does is it looks at what I'm writing in response to them. And it tells me if it's particularly negative, if it's particularly subjective. It makes very helpful suggestions like, you should probably take a walk before you answer this one. Yeah. And it's like getting basically oversight from myself on my best day, which I'm not usually having when I'm answering these questions. And this lets me do the job that I agreed to do, which is basically to be kind and attempt to be helpful, even to people where I find it very challenging to help them. All right. These support and documentation related tools are really specific to my business, but the principle is absolutely the same for the app business. These are your tools for user onboarding, for your app videos, for your screenshots, for your icons, for your media kits. Any of these things where you look around and you say, wow, this is a production task I'm doing, every time that we do an update or every time that fill in the blank. And this is what you have to look at, because these are the things that you have to automate these things and you have to get rid of them. The last thing that I automated was I changed threading APIs in the last version of OpenEars. And so I got to get rid of hundreds of lines of code, really, really specific code. And in exchange for that, I got one horrible new kind of bug. And it was a cross-thread access bug. So because my old code, I knew exactly which thread I was using, and with my new code, I did not know that for sure. So I wrote a very similar kind of automated test a few times, 3 times, which was basically testing a cross-thread access of a particular sequence of methods with a particular timing. And then I realized, well, if I did it 3 times, actually, I have to ask myself how I can automate this. So I wrote something that's basically like a little fuzzer. It's like a tiny little fuzzer. You give it an array of invocations and an overall time frame to run on, and tell it how many permutations to do, and it will just start to split off threads and send messages with the invocation that you asked for until it gets an exception or until you've run it so many times successfully that you stopped getting that kind of exception. And so I think that even with our automated testing, we can automate our automated testing. And this is really useful because it prints out the actual sequence of invocations that it runs into the console, and that means that if you get an exception, you can just copy and paste what's in the console, and then actually your test is written for you in order to replicate what just happened. And you can try this out if you want. I'm really sorry because it's in Objective-C. I know that's really uncool and we don't do that anymore, but this is, I'm sure soon I will get on the same page as everyone else, but this is an Objective-C tool. But it's on GitHub. It's called HW Horror Show because I'm HW, and this is the face that you make while it's running. Right? Agreeableness is the next mouse. This is a word that we have to get used to using because scope isn't just a matter for software design, it actually affects every aspect of a product business. And this word is how we protect it. So no contracting after you're done bootstrapping. I think bootstrapping a product business by contracting is brilliant. It's a great way to start, but when you stop, you have to stop. Because this is a completely different mindset. And thinking about a company or one individual that you're contracting for will always take you away from your questions about how to make good products for your business. No free updates if you can't afford to do that. You need repeat customers. This is a really important form of customer. I can give free updates because my customers make multiple apps, right? If you are an app indie, you actually have to sell, eventually, multiple copies of your software to people. And they might sometimes be annoyed about this. But I think if you're giving them a fair, good update, that's okay. We have to accept that they might get annoyed sometimes. No talking about future plans. When someone asks you about future plans, it's because they're making a plan. As small indies, we don't have control over every aspect of our execution. And that means that you can actually spoil both of your plans by talking about future plans. Cost control is kind of a big deal. We don't talk about it so much in our sector because the sort of dream company for a lot of people is a really high growth, really low revenue, kind of crazy startup with a miraculous exit, right? But here I'm talking about a profitable indie. So you want it actually to start booking a profit in like 12 months, and cost control is a really big part of that. And something that makes cost control very difficult for us is the beautiful products of the Apple Corporation that we buy so many of. Meet your neighbors and form a device pool with them. I would say no, in general, to being a fan of Apple. I think you can like Apple and you can respect Apple. But when you're dealing with such an enormous corporation, you should be clear-eyed about your relationship with them. If you want to be a fan of your peers. They're doing unbelievably cool things, and it will mean much more to them. The last no is really about no to a decision style that is basically avoidant, where we want to avoid hearing negativity from our customers, that is the main way that we make decisions. The reason is that, sometimes when you make a decision, even if you're polite about it and you try to be nice, you will hear people's negativity in response. It's part of life, and it's their right to be negative. But if we never hear people's negativity, it's because we are not saying this word. And if you don't say this word, the mice are going to get you. Creeping horror on the topic of the mice getting you. You have to attend to your psychological well-being if you want to do a small product indie. I think that it's a really universal experience for people doing small product businesses to experience a lot of anxiety. When you're trying to make something work, you worry about how to make it work. But if you make it work, then you worry about losing it, right? And I think the problem with this has to do with misunderstanding the limits of your sphere of control. Here's what you control. You control your plan. You control the beginning of the execution of your plan. And this is such an important thing to understand about small businesses, is that you can actually have your product plans changed by getting the flu if you're one person. And you control the conclusions that you draw from the information that comes into your head, right? And that's it. Everything else that happens is completely out of your control. But if you run a little product business, you will see things happening all throughout your day that you will have the mistaken impression that you can control if you do something about them. And this will drive you nuts. The worst thing about it is that basically if something really wonderful happens and you feel joy, there's going to be like a ceiling on it, because later you will see something which is alarming. I think the other reason that it's very important to get a grip on anxiety is that I think that it is a particularly dangerous situation ethically when people who run a business get confused about the relative importance of a business's life and a human's life, and they see their business tanking, and they start to think about doing things with their assets that ordinarily they would never do, right? And so that means also that if we are not in control of our anxiety, we're actually in ethical danger to other people who use our products and who are around us. For me, I had a little trouble with this year. I found myself, not the ethical part. I don't take any data, so I don't have to worry about that. But with the up and down part, cool things were happening, but then I would get freaked out about something. I looked into a lot of sort of ancient philosophy about this question, and because anxiety, this has been a sort of universal human experience for a long time. And these philosophers were not really big fans of the power of positive thinking. They said, if there's something that you're worried about, you should spend like some serious focused time imagining exactly what that would be like if it happened. And strangely enough, I found this to be a complete relief. So on days when I was stressing about my business, I would decide that it would die tomorrow, that I knew that it would die tomorrow, and I would spend some time thinking about what that would be like. I thought about all of the things that would happen for about 5 minutes, and then I put it away and I don't worry about it anymore because I know when it's going to happen tomorrow. And then I'm free to enjoy it and keep to my values. Strangely, it keeps on not dying tomorrow. That's really nice. I think that this is not necessarily a correct approach to anxiety for everybody. The reason that I mention it is to say that you have to find some approach. The reason is that if you don't, you are going to cheat yourself of the joy in the cool things that you made. And that would be a shame. The last mouse is the doldrums. Not becoming such a dull person that new ideas can't find your address. Small business problems can be addictive, but your creativity is your most important tool. And doing all of this chaos prevention can actually whittle that down into very little indeed. So you have to find some ways to protect your spark, even in the same way that you protect your physical and your mental well-being to the extent that you can. Different for everyone. I don't know if you know this, like if you're visiting Berlin, you might not know this, but behind every building in Berlin, there are sort of like many courtyards in a row. and strange things happen in them. Often many of the same things happening out front, like there's like a hidden restaurant and stores and all kinds of strange stuff. I love getting into these courtyards and seeing what's going on in them. This is my restorative hobby. And I see amazing things. This winter, I saw a koi pond, yeah, and it was frozen. And at the bottom of the pond, it was filled with these golden carp, and they were hibernating. And it was incredibly beautiful. These are the delightful experiences that are the origin of being able to make delightful apps or just having a delightful life. And yeah, I did go back a few months later to make sure that the fish were just sleeping. This is going to be like totally different for you. You know, you're gonna teach a kid how to kick a football, right? Or do a really gross and sweaty DIY project. Go on a date if that is on offer. Go for a high walk in the mountains. I think that the universal thing about it is that it's not going to happen from behind a screen. It's not going to happen from reading that one perfect article about restoring your creativity. You have to get out, yeah? And just please don't eat the seed corn, right? Your creative capacity is the reason that you do this. And it's what got you into this in the first place, and it's the only thing that can move you forward. So, I've described a company that is actually self-sufficient by design, and I hope I've explained that this mostly happens because of a mental framework for making that happen. And I hope that you find it helpful, and I really appreciate your listening. Thank you.